If I kept going around here, we would figure out many, and engineering, many different areas of specialization. I met Michael Spezio back in the spring, I believe it was, of this year, at a conference at Berkeley. And I realized he's absolutely someone who we should have here to this Templeton series of lectures at USC. He fortunately is a neighbor at Caltech, and I'm going to just read you very briefly from the announcement that I'm sure brought you here, but just to remind you that he is a postdoctoral scholar in social and affective neuroscience in the Division of Humanities and Social Sciences, and is also at the Brain Imaging Center at Caltech. He's one of these people who clearly is a sadomasochist because he has 2 PhDs and a degree in theology. And so I think the talk that he's going to give brings these worlds together in a very interesting way. Mindfulness in the Brain, a study of contemplative practice in relation to neural networks of social judgment and meta-awareness. Michael will speak for however long he wants, but probably 45 to 50 minutes. Then there will be an opportunity for some Q&A, and then we'll have a reception right outside here, and that'll be a chance for informal discussion. We also, incidentally, are experimenting with webcasting this event, and so if you want to share this with friends, I'm assuming that it will end up on our website, the Center for Religion and Civic Culture, but otherwise, who knows who might be tuning in to this particular webcast. So, welcome, and Michael, welcome to you.
Thanks very much, Don. Thank you. And thanks for turning out for this. And I'm looking forward. This is a work in progress that I'll be describing tonight. I'll look forward to conversations afterwards to help perhaps add insight and even to entertain critiques, because certainly my thinking about this topic is still in formation. But I am very grateful to be here, and it's really a joy because it allows me to share some details about a project which we are still in the process of analyzing, but whose preliminary analyses have generated some, I think, quite exciting findings. And it's really a great pleasure to be part of the Center for Religion and Civic Culture. I have to say right off the bat that I doubt I'll do justice to all of the disciplines in this interdisciplinary endeavor here tonight, but I hope that there'll be enough to get at many of your backgrounds and hopefully your interests as well. So let me begin by presenting an overview. I'm going to give you a working definition of contemplative practice. I'll place the studies that I've been doing at Caltech in a wider context of scientific approaches to contemplative practice, particularly neuroscientific approaches. I'll go over some contemplative practice. I will explain some of the motivation behind these studies, and then detail some ongoing research and research communities. That'll take up the first part of the talk. The second part of the talk I'll shift to the studies that I'm actually doing. I'll talk about the practice of centering prayer, because centering prayer is the contemplative practice that we are studying at Caltech. Talk about centering prayer and meta-awareness and our findings in that study, and centering prayer and trust decisions. And then I'll end up by with some considerations for the future, and love to entertain questions. And I have my watch out, so I'm going to try and be very mindful of the time. Okay, what's contemplative practice? We define contemplative practice as a suspension, an activity in which there is a suspension, an intended suspension of all discursive and evaluative thought. So discursive thought is simply narrative thought. It is the kind of thought that we often get caught up in, that when you're thinking about sort of daydreaming, making plans for your vacation, making plans for dinner, and thinking, well, first I have to do this, then I have to do this, and wow, that would be really good, you know, have that kind of salad with dinner, that kind of thing. That's discursive thought, and often we get so caught up in that it seems as if the thoughts start thinking us, as opposed to us being really aware of what we're thinking and why at a given time. Evaluative thought is pretty self-explanatory. It's just judgmental thought. This is good, this is bad, you know, and that's the idea is to suspend that intentionally during contemplative practice. So this is not becoming caught up in those thought streams. You know, my friend said this to me. I really think that means they don't like that I did this, and you know, and then it sort of cascades from there. That kind of maybe negative ideation, and also positive ideations. This kind of suspension involves only a return in intention to the practice, and it does not involve an active resistance or pushing away of these thoughts. Okay, there are a diversity of contemplative practices. Perhaps some of you in the room practice some of these or know people who do. There's shamatha, which is focused meditation upon the breath, the sensation of the breath, or an image in the mind. A pebble is often used to develop a tranquil and calm demeanor and disposition. Vipassana is basically in Buddhist thought the next type of meditative practice, contemplative practice beyond shamatha, attending to and perceiving things as they really are. There are forms of yoga from Indian religions, from the Sanskrit to unify or unite. And there are practices that center on the Kabbalah of especially Abraham Abulafia. And then there are a number of Christian practices, Lectio, spiritual exercises of Ignatius, and centering prayer. Centering prayer is a Christian practice, and I'll say more about that. So why study contemplative practice? What would motivate this? Especially from the perspective of a neuroscientist, and I think that's where I'll try to do most of my explanation tonight. There are obviously other motivations that come from other areas. One of the things we would like to do in neuroscience is to fully understand the human embodied mind. Also the non-human embodied, the varieties of non-human mind, but in this case, the non-human or the human embodied mind. We want to apply the sciences of mind to study contemplative practice, and this allows creative engagement with three primary modes, or what I will say perspectives or modes of human knowing. The first mode is knowing in the third person, and this is familiar to every person in academia, including neuroscience. So neuroscience, knowing in the third person means being able to produce observed phenomena through research that are open to replication and shared perceptual formation in discourse. So this happens in areas as diverse as history, religious studies, and also in the neurosciences. The kind of observed phenomena we're going to be creating in our experiments are activations in the brain that associate with behavior. We create those observed phenomena via special, highly specialized technology. So the second way of knowing is via the first person. People often say that they call this subjective experience. I try to stay away from subjective objective. I think that's probably not helpful, since it's very, very difficult to imagine what objective experience would be, or objective knowledge. So first person, we have experienced practitioners, a group of people who are reportedly, self-reportedly, and reportedly in their community and with people who know them, well trained to achieve similar types of experiences. And this was brought out in an article that appeared in Science magazine in 2003, coming out of Cambridge, meeting on neuroscience and contemplative practice that happened at MIT in 2003 by Marsha Baranaga, studying the well-trained mind. The idea being that there are, via these practices, accesses to mental states, experiences that can be made more similar across people, and whose self-reports, therefore, might be more reliable than, say, my self-report when I say, well, I'm detecting that spot of light, or I'm not detecting a spot of light. And then, of course, there's the second person, and this is often neglected in this kind of typology. And the second person is really the dialogical activity between the first and the third person perspective. So I, as a scientist, interacting with people who are experienced practitioners, I need to go beyond interacting with them as biological systems, as people over there, and I actually need to be able to begin to understand their worldview within their own culture and community. That's what I mean by the second person. Is there a question? Yes?
I'm having trouble putting together your two topics. Contemplative practice, you said, was a suspension of all discursive or evaluative thought. That seems to me you're ruling out the experience of the body. It seems to me you're ruling out the third person experience, and you're ruling out the second person experience, because you can't be thinking about the relations of other persons. So it seems to me the study of contemplative practice is perfectly well designed to tell us nothing about these three primary modes of human knowing.
Obviously, I have not done a very good job at stating that the contemplative practice is isolated to the individual in the study. Obviously, I, as a scientist, am not engaging in contemplative practice as I conduct the study. And neither are the practitioners nor I engaging in contemplative practice as we try to speak about it discursively. That would be impossible. So I think it's not true from a variety of contemplative practices to say that, in fact, contemplative practice shuts out all feeling experience in the body. In fact, it's very much the opposite, that you actually are more attuned to experiencing the present moment because of the suspension of these being caught up in these thought and feeling trains. But we can talk more about that afterwards if you like. All right, so why study contemplative practice from a very practical standpoint? Published research actually suggests links between contemplative practice and a variety of health and otherwise physical aspects. So stress reduction, increased rates of physical healing, decreased recurrence of severe depression, and this is above medication alone, also decreased recurrence of anxiety disorder, decreased reduction in brain cortex due to aging. As we age, our brains thin. They become, areas become smaller, more atrophied, and contemplative practice is associated with reduction in that atrophy. Increased connectivity between distant brain areas, electrical connectivity. We don't know, obviously, about what that might mean for mind and thought. Contemplative practice is increasingly being looked to as an inexpensive and perhaps sustainable supplement to or alternative in treatment interventions. And so these kinds of approaches I will just go ahead and detail for you briefly. So one study investigated a technique called mindfulness-based stress reduction, developed by John Kabat-Zinn and developed at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center. Psoriasis is, of course, a very severe skin condition, and if one looks at a contrast between this line, which is with contemplative practice, and this line, which is not, no contemplative practice here. If one takes a look at two graphs, both representing the state-of-the-art medical interventions, one can see that with contemplative practice, this study found that there was an increase in alleviation of the symptoms due to psoriasis. Anxiety disorder. This is work done also by John Kabat-Zinn and colleagues. And if one takes a look at this, and this is the pretreatment phase, and this is an anxiety rating score, so the higher the axis, the greater the anxiety. This is the treatment phase. People underwent 4 weeks of intensive meditation-based or mindfulness-based stress reduction. And then this is post-treatment following out, they underwent 8 weeks of MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction. Then one follows that out for about half a year. And these numbers, which decrease during the treatment stage, stay low. And that was true for 2 groups. And it was also true for looking at depression rating and not just anxiety rating. And this is without medication. So this is a very interesting finding. Effects on immune response done by Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin and other colleagues found that people who went through a mindfulness-based stress reduction program, if they were inoculated with the influenza vaccine, here are your meditators, there was a much higher, statistically reliable higher antibody titer in response to the antiviral immune injection. Okay, so if we look at yogic meditation, we have a case report, and we have intracerebral pain processing in a yoga master. The researchers used a laser to inflict pain on the subject's hands and feet. This causes a sharp pain akin to a pinprick. The normal level for the laser is 320 millijoules for high pain, but this subject actually required 450 millijoules for a rating of 8 out of 10. And in fact, the individual gave a rating of 0 while engaging in the meditative practice at the 450 level. This actually was associated with reduced brain activation in areas associated with pain perception. Now, if we look over here, this is the percent signal change. What's in red is the non-meditating condition. In blue is the meditating condition. And you can see that all of these areas, the thalamus, the somatosensory cortex 2, and the insula, associated with pain perception and pain rating, and the cingulate cortex associated with the elements of suffering or the perception of how serious the pain is, all of those were decreased as the subject was giving a rating of 0 at the high pain level. Now, if we compare this individual was obviously a religious individual. We just talked about MBSR, which is a secular form of meditative practice developed by John Kabat-Zinn. If we compare spiritual focus to positive thought meditation, so we're looking at spirituality versus a secular kind of meditation that focuses on positive thought about the self. This is work done by Kenneth Pargament and was just out last year. And there were 3 groups here. A spiritual group, which the individuals, none of the individuals in any of the groups had learned to meditate or had done meditation in the past. They were all taken from a group of individuals who wanted to learn meditation, to try and control for individual differences between people who are inclined to meditate and those who are not. There were 3 groups. One was a spiritual group, which focused on statements about God or the earth and their relation to those entities, if you will. The other one was a positive control group, so talking about positive things about the self. I am happy, I am relaxed, I am so on. And the other one was a relaxation group. The instruction that they were given was try not to fall asleep, but try to relax as much as you can while sitting, and don't get caught up in all kinds of thoughts. And they used the cold pressor task, which is depicted here. The subject's hand is in water that is between 0 and 4 degrees Celsius. As anyone knows, if you immerse your hand in that, that's going to produce extremely sharp pain after a very short time. We do this in our lab, and it works. What we found, or what they found, was if they were looking at just the duration of the cold pressor task. So the subject is allowed to remove their hand at any time they want. And after going through weeks of either secular meditation or relaxation meditation, the time in the water was about a minute. That did not increase at all due to the meditation. That was where the subjects were at the beginning. But if we look here at the spiritual meditation, there's almost a twofold compared to the secular and the relaxation. And this was well increased, also not just between groups, but also within subject, well increased beyond what was their baseline. So there are these studies. We'll just take a quick look at the aging brain, the findings that I mentioned before. This is work by Sarah Lazar, who did this work in Boston. There was a treatment group, which was 20 individuals with extensive experience in Buddhist Vipassana meditation. They had 9 years of experience on average, and these were their occupations. There were a couple of full-time meditation teachers in there. There were mainly males, 100% Caucasian, and their years of education, they had a lot of education. So they had a comparison. She had a comparison group of 15 individuals. They matched very well on age and years of education, but they didn't do any meditation at all. And she did obviously take people from a meditation wait list, again, to try and control for differences between people who have interest and who do not have interest in meditation. And what she found was that in the meditators, areas of cortex in the insula and in the prefrontal cortex here were thicker. And that was true across age. So if this is cortical thickness and this is age, the red squares here are the non-meditators. And you can see that they give the predictable pattern of falling cortical thickness across age, but the blue circles here are the meditators, and their cortical thickness was essentially unchanged. And that's a very exciting finding. So this group of research, this group of research interests, motivations, what have you, for studying contemplative practice has given rise to a number of research communities. And one of those is focusing around the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine at the National Institutes of Health, or NCAM. This center is funding a number of projects looking at meditation, contemplative practices, and their effects on stress. The Mind and Life Institute is a consortium of neuroscientists and originally mainly Buddhists, including the Dalai Lama. And this is Steve Koslin, who's a Harvard neuroscientist and cognitive psychologist, explaining his work to the Dalai Lama at one of the Mind and Life Institute meetings. They sponsor meditation retreats for scientists that are distinctly non-sectarian in nature. They are emphasizing the practice and do not emphasize any kind of sectarian cultural symbols that go with that practice. Here's a picture of work done by people at the Mind and Life Institute on retreat. This is actually out in Nepal. And then this is Richie Davidson with Mathieu Ricard, who is the French translator for the Dalai Lama and has authored a number of works about neuroscience and meditation. And Mathieu is a regular subject of Richie's here. And then this is a depiction of the increased connectivity that has resulted from these studies. And then at Brown University, there's even a contemplative studies initiative being developed, which is a consortium of religious studies, philosophy, computational studies, neuroscience, neurobiology. So there are a lot of exciting developments in this area. And the work that I'm going to now shift to talk about should really be understood within this community of researchers. Okay, what is centering prayer? That is the focus of the studies tonight. Centering prayer is a Christian contemplative practice dating back to the early desert monastics and very much popularized and revitalized by Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. It has a worldwide following, loosely organized around groups within an organization called Contemplative Outreach, founded by Father Thomas Keating. Father Thomas is a Cistercian monk, and he is, or was, abbot at the Snowmass Monastery in Snowmass, Colorado, a Benedictine, but a Benedictine of the strict observance. So there are over 20 of these groups just in the Southern California, actually the greater Los Angeles area alone. And what is it? So the way that people describe centering prayer is that it is an intentional orientation in mind or a consent to the presence and connection of the divine to all life at all times. Okay, so this connection and presence are present at all times. So all life is held by divine compassion and love in unity with the divine. And the centering part of centering prayer is, according to people in this tradition, intending, consenting to be aware, to become acknowledging or recognizing of this connection, which is so often lost in most of life. So in the words of our participants, this kind of summarizes it. The eyes are closed, you're seated comfortably, one uses a sacred word, which is not a mantra or a chant, only when one notices being caught up in the flow of thoughts and feelings. These sacred words can be things like love or peace or all or trust. This is actual words from one of our participants. One sits in a comfortable position, back straight, feet on the floor, hands gently on knees, close eyes, and introduce sacred word to signify consent to the practice, to the presence and action of God. Let the flow of thoughts go on by. This is another participant. Only when you become involved in them should you repeat your sacred word. When I notice, yet another participant, when I notice or realize that I am following my own thoughts rather than being open to God, I think of my symbol to clear away my own thoughts. Okay, why study this? Well, most studies, as I've depicted so far, focused on Eastern contemplative practices. They try to understand how these practices relate to health, attention, and meta-awareness, being mindful, being aware when one is not paying attention to the moment, to the task at hand, right? No published studies have been done on centering prayer to date, and only 2 neuroscience labs are working with groups who do centering prayer. John Cohen's lab at Princeton, John is a researcher in neuroscience there, and our lab at Caltech. And what we want to do is we would like, first of all, to compare the processes at the brain level to what is being found for the Eastern traditions, to ask if there are any similarities, to what extent there are similarities at the level of brain processing regarding health, attention, and mindfulness meta-awareness. But, and this is where it takes off into a new and interesting direction, I think, a very interesting interdisciplinary direction. We want to focus on the claimed social outcomes of such practice. And many of these practices, including centering prayer, claim that their practice results in increased compassion for people, increased positive feeling for people, and increased ability to be with other people when those other people are facing difficulty. This is an important area, and I just show this cover of Robert Putnam's book, Putnam being an eminent sociologist at Harvard, social psychologist, political scientist, thank you, at Harvard. And he's done some terrific work on the sociology of trust in society, social capital in society, and stressing the need for this kind of positive social relation. And so that's one of the reasons we'd like to study centering prayer, because it is one of these traditions that makes these claims. But first, before I turn to the study of trust, let me detail for you our study of meta-awareness. Why is this important? It's important because we want to ask, what are those areas in the brain that are most closely associated with really being aware and focused on centering prayer during centering prayer? Only when we have that in hand can we ask the question about whether those areas are also involved in trust judgments as a result of doing the practice. Okay, I hope to explain to you a little bit and unpack that for you through the remainder of the talk. Okay, for our study of meta-awareness, we had 7 practitioners, and we are at this point right now in the study, but we have plans, and we actually have people preliminarily involved so that we can increase this to about 15. The mean age of these individuals is around 50. Centering prayer often happens to people in later life. It's not true that many people who are Christians and under the age of 30 practice centering prayer. That's a rarity. Most of them had at least, all of them had at least 3 years of experience. Most of them had at least 5 to 6 years of experience at the practice. So you'll notice we're not studying adepts at centering prayer. That's one area, and the group at Princeton is doing a very nice job at studying people who've been practicing for in excess of 25, 30 years. What we're trying to do is ask, what do moderate practitioners, what can we see in those practitioners? Because in fact, most of the groups involved with contemplative outreach, doing this practice, etc., in fact, most of the groups of Eastern practitioners are not people who have had in excess of 30 years, 30,000 hours of meditation like someone like Father Thomas or Mathieu Ricard in the Buddhist tradition. All right, so they all practice at least 2 hours a week, and most of them, did around 3 to 4 hours. All measurements and centering prayer was done within the MRI while it's on. So that's a caveat to those of you who know that means it's a very loud environment. It's a very unnatural environment. In fact, these people sit in a quiet space. They sit. They don't lie down on their backs surrounded by this pounding machine. So if we see anything at all, it's actually it's a very lucky thing, because this was a very foreign environment to our practitioners. And we want to focus on within subject differences between 2 counterbalanced conditions, each lasting about 15 minutes. One condition was listening intently to a boring auditory narrative. Why did it have to be listening? Well, because we need to compare their centering prayer practice to something that they could do with their eyes closed and which required a lot of focused attention. So we didn't want to make it like a Grisham novel. That would be really very easy to attend to, and you could sort of remember salient details. But if it's a boring narrative, not a not complex narrative, not an unimportant narrative, as you'll see in a minute, but a fairly dry, boring narrative, we thought it might really require their attentive listening. And the second condition, obviously, is practicing centering prayer. So let me diagram that for you. Their task was a button press, and they were instructed to hit the left button when you notice that your mind is wandering, when you become aware of your lack of awareness, and you say, oh, I better get back to it. Hit the right button when you're actually back on the task. So we didn't want to assume that as soon as people were aware that they were right back on task, because sometimes it takes, and in fact with our participants it didn't take very long. It took an average of about 3 seconds for people to get back on task from when they noticed that their mind was wandering. So this is what it looks like. The mind wandering, here's the mind wandering button press. So for analysis, we went back 20 seconds in this time course prior to them saying, oops, I was wandering. And we took the first 15 seconds of that 20 seconds for our analysis. When they were back on task, this green bar represents being back on task. That's the button. This distance here is roughly about 3 seconds on average. And we went out 5 seconds and took the next 15 seconds. So we were comparing 15 seconds and 15 seconds. And this makes some assumptions, and we can't really get around those. We only have their self-report here and here. We certainly are not interested in what's going on with pressing the button. So we want to sort of get away from that, which is why we went out 5 seconds here. And we did talk with the subjects. It seems reasonable, this seems eminently reasonable, that once they got back into it, they were into it for at least 15 seconds or 20 seconds before they got out of it. And that actually is corroborated by some of our behavioral evidence. This is more of an assumption, and we can talk about that later if that's of interest. And so what sound did we play to contrast these conditions, or what auditory narrative? Well, we thought it would be kind of fun to ask a number of, it's a little out of focus, sorry about that, to ask Christians to listen to Charles Darwin. We thought that would be kind of a nice fun thing to do. And so let me sort of try to...
At the anterior extremity it has 2 pairs of feelers, the upper ones of which resemble in shape the ears of a quadruped. On each side of the lower surface, or foot...
Okay, so that gives you an idea.
Oops. I observed the habits of some marine animals.
That gives you an idea of how dry the narrative was. And it was Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle. Very important work, extremely interesting work, actually. But on a scale of 1 to 10, all of our subjects rated it about a 2 in terms of excitement. All right. So all of the participants actually reported more episodes of mind wandering during centering prayer than they did during the listening. I don't really, my own sense is that I don't believe this. I actually think that they're more well-trained when it comes to centering prayer, to noticing when they're wandering. But that's another thing that we can talk about. So if we look at the time before of their awareness and look at which areas in the brain were more activated when they were wandering compared to when they were back on task, we see these areas in the somatosensory regions in the brain. They were pretty much, uncomfortable in the scanner. They had to stay still. That's our interpretation. It's consistent with these findings. So this is somatosensory cortex. We also see huge activation in the visual cortex. Even though we could actually monitor, we had an eye tracker on them, they never opened their eyes during this. So we know that they weren't looking around. So this is This is due to, presumably, although we don't know this for sure, presumably due to the fact that they were daydreaming, mind-wandering, imaging. They were seeing lots of images. Well, I'm going to go this place, that place, what have you. But there was a lot of activation back here in visual cortex when they were wandering compared to when they were back on task. After they refocused, if we actually see activation in the right parietal area, which is back here in the brain, known to be an area. This is crossing inferior parietal and supramarginal gyrus. So this is an area that's both known to be involved in attention as well as bodily focus, and known also to be involved in judging emotion. This area in the prefrontal cortex, so after they're refocused compared to when they were wandering, we see this whopping unilateral signal in the right prefrontal cortex, indicating this is very much what we might predict in terms of higher order cognition. Now, during the narration, so this was during meditation, the meditation condition. During listening to the narration, when they were wandering, we only saw a little bit of visual activation in the visual cortex. There was not very much difference. But after refocusing, we also see this bilateral parietal activation and some in the prefrontal, but again, bilateral, a little higher up, and definitely not unilateralized to the right. So the summary is that while focused on centering prayer, the neural networks we observed were in the right prefrontal and right parietal SMG. So why is that important? Because those are the areas that we're going to ask whether they are also involved in making trust decisions as a result of doing the centering prayer practice. So let's go on to trust. Now, for trust decisions, we want to understand how visual information goes through the eye, into the brain, very quickly through this pathway here to this structure called the amygdala, which is depicted here, and then out to the visual cortex, and then back into the amygdala, etc., leading to some kind of judgment, like this person looks afraid, or leading to a judgment, well, is she trustworthy, or isn't she trustworthy? So that's what we're going to be looking at, and we want to ask, particularly here, questions about plasticity in very early processing, say processing in the amygdala, and how top-down modulation in using structures in the prefrontal cortex might affect activation or be related to activation in the amygdala. So those areas, these areas are called the bottom-up, the reflexive, the automatic, the system one processes, sort of going on without any intention. These areas are typically thought of, again, it's a heuristic, it's obviously a false dichotomy, but it's a useful heuristic as top-down, reflective, controlled system two. And what we want to do is ask whether doing the practice unifies in some manner the activation in both of these regions. So we know a lot about going from bottom up to top down areas. We don't know so much about going in the other direction. So that's one of the things we'll be looking at. So briefly, the trust task is to decide whether faces are trustworthy or untrustworthy. There were 80 faces in all. They were all Caucasian. They were all men. They were all smiling. And they were all images of real politicians that were used in campaigns in 2000 and 2002. We wanted to try to go for some realism. These are fairly well, this is a very well characterized set. It was used by Alexander Todorov at Princeton University to do some very interesting work on political decision making. So let me show you the overview of a trial. A fixation box appears in the center of the subject's monitor. This is followed by a very, very, very brief presentation of an image. This is followed by a pause, so the image goes off. The subject has time to make a trust decision. and the interval is about 4 seconds. The computer sees whether or not the person made the decision. If the decision is made, go on to the next trial. If not, then go and cycle around until the person hits the button to make the decision. So each time a picture appears, we record the time it appears, and we count that as an event for our analysis. So there's a cycle 1 when it happened once. If the person didn't make a decision, it goes around again. It's cycle 2, etc. And then when the decision is made, we call these one-cycle trials if the person only needed 1 cycle to make the decision, 2-cycle trials if the person needed 2 cycles to make the decision. And in the main, our subjects took 2 cycles. So that's the data that I'll be talking about. So this is an example. So you can see it's very, very brief indeed. Not much time at all. That's actually faster than, slower than what the subjects actually saw. So we actually asked people, our subjects, because we needed a balance, we asked them to make the same number of trust and no trust decisions. And if you look at the image number, so this is specific for the 80 images, for all images that were decided on 2 cycle trials, you can see that there were approximately the same number of trust and no trust decisions. So our subjects are kindly accommodating us, doing what we ask. This is not sort of just a nonsense task. In fact, people are very consistent. This is the number of images here, and this is the fraction of agreement. So 1 indicates that all the subjects decided the same way. That image is trustworthy or that image is not trustworthy. And that was very, very consistent, and mostly people made very consistent choices, and chance level is down here at 50%. So most of our images were well above chance, which indicates that this task is really accessing something real about the way people make these trustworthiness decisions. They're just not flying and doing, well, whatever is random. And so now if we take a look at the votes, these are our 2 most trustworthy faces. So 6 out of our 7 rated this person as trustworthy. 5 out of our 7 rated this person as trustworthy. These are our most untrustworthy. All of them, 5 out of 7, rated them most untrustworthy. Now if we count the votes, that might explain a little bit about what's going on in terms of the House and the Senate. I don't know. So okay, so let's take a look at trust in the brain, and then I'll finish up very shortly here. When we're looking at, now of course they couldn't do centering prayer or listen to the narrative while they were doing the trust, so we did a 10-minute segment of either listening to the narrative or doing centering prayer, again counterbalanced across subjects, and then we asked them to do the trust task. So 10 minutes of either narrative or practice, and then the trust task. After doing the practice for 10 minutes, going on to do the trust task, in fact, we have this sort of low-level, gut-level activation in the amygdala that's associated with people who are not trustworthy. So we're looking at areas in the brain that are more activated when someone was judged untrustworthy compared to trustworthy, and we're only looking at the first presentation of that. So the first cycle in a 2-cycle decision, in a 2-cycle trial. Interestingly, we also see this activation in the right prefrontal cortex, and we have slightly more superior in the right parietal area and the right SMG. This very similar. This is actually almost perfectly overlaid. This is slightly more superior. This is almost perfectly overlaid, very well overlapping what we saw for our mindfulness and our mind wandering, our meta-awareness study. So this is very interesting that you see the early gut level activation associating with these areas that we saw for our participants as being involved when they are really on task and really aware. And so this, remember, is very early on, just for the first presentation of the image, a good 7 seconds or more before they ever make their decision. And so this is it's very exciting. So if we look after narrative, we see just some activation in the parietal, so there was greater attention to the untrustworthy faces. And if we look at the cycle 2, we have some areas of cortex that are associated with negative emotion, negative emotive processing, the splenial cortex and the paracingulate cortex. So one of the interesting things is we did not find amygdala activation in this group of people after they did the narrative task. That's an interesting observation. I could comment more if people have questions about that. Now let me draw some conclusions and then finish up. So being mindful during contemplative practice seems for our group, for this practice, to involve neural circuits in the right prefrontal and parietal cortices. After doing the practice in social judgments of trust, these neural circuits, or they're not the same neural circuits, but we can't say that they are or they aren't, but overlapping regions of the brain showed activation, and showed activation along with the amygdala that is known to take place when people are judging someone not trustworthy compared to trustworthy. So that's a very exciting finding that these two agree. And then after listening to the narrative, the participants did not show amygdala activation. And this difference is consistent with a hypothesis, which we have not tested in this study, obviously, but it's a hypothesis that emerges from this study, the set of studies, that perhaps centering prayer allows people to become more emotionally open to what's going on in the world, at least immediately following the practice. So as we look to the future, we certainly need to recruit more practitioners, and we've got at least 30 psychological assessments on each of our practitioners. We're going to be using those to recruit very, very well-matched controls on personality, anxiety, religious orientation, etc., to ask about the long-term effects of practice. So controls who have never done any practice versus our practitioners who've done several years, right? We want to actually conduct functional connectivity analyses so that we can ask directly whether the co-activation that we're getting in the amygdala and those prefrontal and parietal areas, whether they actually are very tightly correlated as well as just happening at the same chunk of time. So we want to ask very formally, using mathematical methods that I won't go into, about that functional connectivity. And then we want to move on to more complex social decisions involving aspects of compassion. I think this is a very exciting area for this kind of contemplative, this study of contemplative practice. Lastly, let me thank Ralph Adolphs, who's been really supportive as head of the lab, really supportive of this work. Andrew Tan helped with a great deal of this work as a part of his summer undergraduate research fellowship this summer. Hak-Jin Kim, who's a postdoc in the lab, designed the kind of paradigm which we're calling the temporally extended decision-making paradigm that we used in the trust task. And I really want to give large thanks to the contemplative practitioners themselves, all very patient, all very willing to participate, and the Mind and Life Institute for funding this. And this is a picture of a number of people in the lab, and there's Ralph there. So thanks very much. Be happy to take any questions that people have at this time.
Are you taking any physiologic measures of like heart rate or things related to how the mind controls physiologic state?
That's a really good question. The answer to that is, while they're in the scanner, we do take their galvanic skin response to the pictures. I haven't actually analyzed those data yet. We also, during the mindfulness, the mind-wandering mindfulness meta-awareness study, we also take their heart rate and that's in order to control for differences in heart rate, which we don't really see, actually. And then finally, we are doing the cold pressor task with these individuals as well. And so those studies, I haven't even finished collecting the data for that, but what's happened with the first couple of participants has been quite interesting and motivates me to continue that. And for that, we're collecting their respiration, their heart rate, their galvanic skin response, as well as measuring their subjective reporting of pain, as well as how long they stay in the water. So, yeah, that's a very good question. Yes?
It's like Zen had really good results, even though, I mean, he's more in the secular kind of meditation.
Yes, that's right.
He's been doing it for a long time.
He's been doing that for a long time. Yes. Yeah, so, I mean, if the question is, I actually think that Ken Pargament's study comparing the spiritual to the secular is, you know, a nice first sort of cut at that. But in fact, as anyone who knows anything about MBSR knows, it's not exactly thinking positive thoughts about yourself. It's much richer than that. And it's very well grounded in traditional Buddhist practice without the Buddhist content, really. Yeah. And so I think that the real comparison, if you will, has not yet been done. So I think, yeah, that's a very good observation. Yes?
What's the main question you personally would like to see answered with this research?
Well, I think there are a couple, but the main question, I think, is a better understanding of how intentional cognitive set interacts with very automatic, or what we think is automatic processing way down in the brain. That, to me, is the challenge that we're faced with in the 21st century. And right now, our techniques are actually not quite there. I mean, this gets to the heart of what we mean by human freedom, human agency. And I think studying people who are engaged in a very intentional activity that obviously takes great effort, because they always report that they're deviating from it, coming back to it. Getting beyond our simplistic, although very useful to this point in time, our simplistic dual process models of a system 1 and a system 2, separate in the brain, separate in the person, interacting with one another. That, I think, is the main research question, the main question that I have as a neuroscientist and a person thinking more largely about decision-making by humans. Yes, in the back?
I just wanted to know, you used this phrase greater emotional openness in talking about your hypothesis about what leads us to. That seems to me a rather imprecise notion. I'm wondering if that's
seems to me too.
Presentation, or is it, are you using more controlled notions in the actual analysis of the data? Yeah,
that's just a terribly imprecise way. But this is why I said it suggests this. Now that's a concept. Now I have to move from concept to operational definition, and then actually go back to the lab and test this hypothesis. As I said, the evidence so far does not test that hypothesis. It's perhaps consistent with a hypothesis that would be much more well specified in terms of some kind of notion of emotional openness. But that's a concept that's a little too fuzzy, and that I need to go back to the lab to really iron out. I think that's right. Yeah. Anne, did you have a question?
Yeah, sort of follow up on that point. Did you do any self-report measures of the recognition of the politicians, or the trust, or the affect measures?
That's a really good question. So did we do any self-report? In fact, we did. None of the subjects recognized any of the politicians. These were all obscure house races from 2 to 4 years ago. Or sorry, 4 to 6 years ago. we also had each participant sit down for what seemed to them like forever and rate each face on a scale of -10 to 10 with regard to attractiveness, age, how old they thought the person was, trust. We wanted to get not just a yes or no, but how much. And those data were still sort of reducing, and then we'll use those in our analyses as well. It was done after, because the reason we did not want them going into the scanner having already been familiarized with the faces. And I should say that the two narrative and centering prayer conditions, they use different facial sets. So they really were not the same 80. There was 40 here and 40 here, and those were mixed around for each subject. So we really tried to counterbalance those kinds of things pretty well. That's a good question. Yes?
Were the subjects as a group composed of Democrats or Republicans?
That's a good question. They were pretty much all fairly liberal Democrats. This has been a problem, actually, in some of our other work. We have also recruited, using images like these, for real work on political decision-making, strictly political decision-making. And it's tough because we can't really find around the Pasadena area, I guess, people who really span the spectrum. So that could very well be an issue. I'm not claiming that this group is at all representative, but it just is a kind of funny result that the most trustworthy faces happen to be Republicans. Yeah. So, yes, ma'am.
Why did you use pictures of only male Caucasian?
It's a good question. Why did we use only male Caucasian? And the reason, the main reason is statistical power. And what I mean by that is our group is small. Even when we recruit and work with the rest of our contemplatives, it's going to be a small group. It's not going to be more than 15 people. We have counterbalancing that we have to take account of. And it's already known through the work of very good work done by social psychologists and others that gender and ethnic in-group, out-group type things all play a major role for trustworthiness. So, for example, I didn't want to have the brain activations be different according to trust, no trust, and then look and see, oh, all the no trusts were, people in ethnic out groups, and, all the trusts were people in ethnic in groups. That would have been terrible because the visual stimuli, the visual nature between those stimuli could be so very, very different that that would confound the interpretation of the brain activations. And it's just a matter really of the statistical power and the photography that we had on hand. I mean, there are just, as you might imagine, we do have sets of literally hundreds of these candidates. And in those candidates, in terms of how many women and people who are other ethnicities besides white, it's very low frequency. So, yeah, that's an issue. Yes, sir?
Have you been able to identify any other groups that show a similar response to those who experience with this centering prayer? So, for example, I'm thinking of people who know how to focus well, like athletes, or maybe those who have learned how to deal with very stressful situations, and maybe show a similar sort of response to those sorts of tasks.
No, that's a very, very good point. So people perhaps who are extremely socially positive, extroverts who are very positive, or people, if what you're saying, people who are very focused. I mean, that's a tough one because you can imagine focus due to a number of, in a number of domains, mathematics. There could even be focus in terms of doing damage to other people. People could be very, very focused at harming other people and really well-intentioned. So it's a good question, and we just haven't explored that area. I do want to explore, though, people who by personality are just, you know, very outgoing, pro-social, etc., and ask, do we see the same kinds of things? You know, that's where the personality assessments, the self-report measures are very important.
It would be interesting to see whether or not one can have the same sort of response.
Yes.
But through a different route of getting there.
Exactly. That's exactly right. That's right. There was another hand up over here. If that person... No? Okay. Yes, sir.
Okay, well, I'm having some trouble evaluating the result. If I understand, you're saying that during cycle 1, for people who've just come off doing the contemplative prayer exercise, then you get more amygdala activation for trustworthy faces than untrustworthy.
The other way around. Untrustworthy is greater than trustworthy.
All right, and you're saying you don't get that after a narrative.
No, not in this group. That could just be a statistical power issue.
Well, that's what I guess that's my worry. With only 7 subjects, there's not much statistical power there. So are you confident that this is not just, I mean, this is the first half of the question, are you confident that it's not just an interesting fluke?
Well, I don't think it would be, it's an interesting fluke, but I do think because of other work that has been done, there's really only been one paper published done by the group at University College London. One paper published investigating the amygdala and decisions of trust. And in fact, that paper showed with, I believe there were 14 or 16 participants in that paper, none of whom did any kind of centering prayer, that there was a slightly greater activation in the amygdala to faces judged untrustworthy as compared to faces judged trustworthy. So we were expecting to see that. The surprising thing that we didn't see it, on the one hand, it's surprising that we saw it just with 7 participants in the centering prayer condition. The other result that we didn't see it after the narrative is perhaps not surprising, because if Joel Winston went back and cut his data and just had 7 or 8 participants, he didn't see amygdala activation in that comparison either. But the fact that we do with centering prayer is at the very least intriguing, and I don't think... Okay.
Because now you're saying that in fact there was another subject, another study without any centering prayer where you did get this same differential. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. But that's not so. That goes right along with our hypotheses. Remember, the
you were telling us that it was openness to love, and I don't. If this other study had it where there was nothing about testing for openness to love, I don't see. So let me give you the second half of the question, and then maybe you can address my confusion.
Okay.
But do you have anything like a causal story?
No. This work, as all neuroimaging work, is correlative in nature.
I understand. I'm saying to you, in your moments of discursive thought, do you have some ideas about?
I would love to talk with you about that afterwards. It's definitely getting, Okay. No. It's just getting a little late, and so. But I do want to address I wasn't able to completely set this up just due to time, but we fully expect that when we increase the number of participants, that we will get an amygdala activation even after narrative. No trustworthy versus trustworthy, right? Not trustworthy versus trustworthy. The surprising aspect is that we get a very powerful, very statistically reliable activation in the amygdala with only 7 subjects after the centering prayer. That's intriguing to me. Could be a weird fluke. That's why we need to do more subjects. our minds are always open about that and want to investigate that some more. But it's not worrisome at all that we didn't see the amygdala activation after the auditory. Yes.
Yeah, you had 7 subjects, and I was just wondering, is the level of activity the same in all the 7 subjects in those specific areas?
No, so that's a good question.
What is the variation in the level of activity?
Well, there is some variation, but it's not more than, these differences. This is a sort of hazard of MRI as well, functional magnetic resonance imaging. These differences are not more than a couple of tenths, maybe 0.2 to 0.3% of signal change. And so the variation is within 0.1% of the signal across subject. So in terms of the variation, it's not greater than, say, 20 to 25% of the difference between the conditions. I think there are more questions, but I'm not sure if should we keep going?
One more question, and then we will move to informal conversation.
Okay. All right. I think someone. Yes.
A two-part question. Have there been similar MRI studies involving Eastern religious practitioners? And if there have been, were the same regions active during?
So that's an easy one. There have not been. Ours is really the first such study with a contemplative practice to look specifically at social judgments. There have not been. So, all right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.